Hi guys. So I haven't done a study stream in a while, but we are back. I have to log in for Apush today. So um yeah, we're gonna log in for a little bit. We're gonna try doing Pomodoro method. Make it just try to focus for at least 15 minutes. 15 minutes. And we're gonna study. So You guys are just gonna listen to me anyways. Okay. I am gonna be reading the history textbook out loud so that I can actually understand it and pretend to teach you guys using my hands. Yeah. Alright. Okay, so the growing average of social and economic injustice helped produce many reformers committed to the pursuit of what became known as social justice. Social justice is a term widely used around the world to describe a kind of justice that goes beyond the individual, seeking justice for society as a whole. Advocates of social justice are likely to believe in an egalitarian society and support for poor and oppressed people. That impulse helped create the rise of what became known as the social gospel. By the early 20th century, or the 1900s, it had become a powerful movement with American Protestantism, and to a lesser extent with American Catholicism and Judaism. It was chiefly concerned with redeeming the nation's cities. The Salvation Army, which began in England but soon spread to the United States, was one example of the fusion of religion with reform. A Christian social welfare organization with a vaguely military structure. By 1900, it had recruited 3,000 officers and 20,000 privates, and was offering both material aid and spiritual service to the urban poor. In addition, many ministers, priests, and rabbis left traditional parish work to serve in the troubled cities. Charles Sheldon's hint in his steps, the story of young men who abandoned a comfortable post to work among the needy, sold more than 50 million copies. It was one of the most successful novels of the era. So, what kind of changed was the social gospel. It became like the fusion between religion and helping out with reform and helping out the poor. So it became like kind of sacrificial thing, like, oh, we're gonna do this to help redeem the people or like some of the people. Father John Ryan, which is also like someone who really practiced social gospel, was he was a guy. Walter Rauschenbusch, a Protestant theologian from Rochester, New York, published a series of influential discourses on the possibilities of human salvation through Christian reform. To him, the message of Darwinism was not the survival of the fittest. He believed rather that all individuals should work to ensure a humanitarian evolution of social fabric. Some American Catholics seized on the 1893 publication of Pope Leo XIII's encyclical Rerum Novarum as justification for their own crusade for social justice. Catholic literals such as Father John A. Ryan took to heart the Pope's warning that a small number of very rich men have been able to lay upon the masses of the poor a yoke little better than slavery itself. For decades, he worked to expand the scope of Catholic social welfare organizations. I did 15 minutes ago. The settlement house movement. An element of much progressive thought was the belief in the influence of the environment on individual development. Social Darwinists such as William Graham Sumner had argued that people's fortunes reflected their inherent fitness for survival. Progressive theorists disagreed. Ignorance, poverty, even criminality, they argued, were not the result of inherent genetic failings or the workings of providence. They were rather the effects of an unhealthy environment. So yeah, they were saying if you are poor, you're not wealthy, or like that kind of wealthy. It kind of just showed how fit you are for this. But progressive theorists, which were the new theorists, disagree with this. They thought that ignorance, poverty, even criminality were not the result of genetic failings, which survival of the fittest made sense, which said, or the workings of providence. They were rather the effects of an unhealthy environment, an environment that is not meant to raise someone with like good stuff. To elevate the distress, therefore, required an improvement of the conditions in which they live. So the whole point is not to blame them for saying, "Oh, you're just not fit for this." You're saying, but rather to help them with their upbringing and make a better environment for them to be getting better. So one of the people that did this, and one of the very popular people, are Jane Addams and the Whole House. Nothing produced more distress. Many urban reformers believed that in the crowded immigrant neighborhoods, which publicists such as Jacob Riis was exposing through vivid photographs and lurid descriptions. One response to the problems of such communities brought from England was the settlement house. The most famous and one of the first was Hull House, which opened in 1889. The most famous and one of the Hull House, which opened in 1889 in Chicago as a result of the efforts of the social worker Jane Addams. It became a model for more than 400 similar institutions throughout the nation. Staffed by members of the educated middle class, settlement houses sought to help immigrant families adapt to the language and customs of their new country. Settlement houses avoided the condescension and moral disapproval of earlier philanthropic efforts, but they generally embraced the belief that middle class Americans had a responsibility to impart their own values to immigrants and to teach them how to create middle class lifestyles. So it's kind of like responsibility. Like if you're born with a better society, it was kind of our job to make sure that people that aren't born with this have equal opportunity or like an opportunity to live at least in the middle class. And they borrowed the settlement houses, which Ajay and Adams set up in Georgia, which is the first one, or like the most important one. It was the whole house, and that helped. Young college women, mostly unmarried, were important participants in the settlement house movement. Working in a settlement house, which protected working in a settlement house, which is a protected site that served mostly women, was consistent with the widespread assumptions that women needed to be sheltered from difficult environments. The clean and well-tended buildings the settlement house created were not only a model for immigrant women, but appropriate site for elite women as well. The settlement houses created another important element of progressive reform, the profession of social work. Workers at Hull House, for example, maintained a close relationship with University of Chicago's pioneering work in this field of sociology. A growing number of programs for the professional training of social workers began to appear in the nation's leading universities, partly in response to the activities of these settlements. So these settlement houses, these reforms that they were doing to help those that were born into like not the best environment. The survival of the fittest, social Darwinism, it was trying to kind of moving away. We're getting progress. We're not being, oh, that's just the way it is. But we're actually, oh, we're gonna change the way it is. Yeah. The allure of expertise. As the emergence of the social work profession suggests, progressives involved in humanitarian efforts place a high value on knowledge and expertise. Even non-scientific problems they believe could be analyzed and solved scientifically. Many reformers came to believe that only enlightened experts and well-designed bureaucracies could create the stability and order America needed. Some reformers even spoke of the creation of a new civilization, in which the expertise of scientists and engineers could be brought to bear on the problems of the economy and society. The social scientist Thorstein Veblen, for example, proposed a new economic system in which powers could reside in the hands of highly trained engineers. Only they, he argued, could fully understand the machine process by which modern society must be governed. Mm, okay, sorry. The professions. The late 19th century saw a dramatic expansion in the number of Americans engaged in administrative and professional tasks. Industries needed managers, technicians, and accountants as well as workers. Cities required commercial, medical, legal, and educational services. New technology required scientists and engineers, who in turn required institutions and contractors to train them. By the turn of the century, those performing these services had come to constitute a distinct social group, which some historians have called a new middle class. So, new middle class professions were like people managers, people working for other people, but like they were still like important jobs. Anyways, new middle class placed a high value on education and individual accomplishment. By the early 20th century, its millions of members were building organizations and establishing standards to secure their position in society. The idea of professionalism had been a frail one in America even as late as 1880, when every patent medicine salesman could claim to be a doctor, when every frustrated politician could set up shop as a lawyer, when anyone could read and write could pose as a teacher. The professional label by itself carried little weight. There were, of course, skilled and responsible doctors, lawyers, teachers, and others, but they had no way of controlling or distinguishing themselves clearly from the amateurs, charlatans, and incompetents who presumed to practice their trades. As the demand for professional service increases, so the pressures for reform. American Medical Association. Among the first to respond was the medical profession. In 1901, doctors who considered themselves trained professionals reorganized the American Medical Association into a national professional society. By 1920, two-thirds of all American doctors were members. The AMA quickly called for strict scientific standards for admission to the practice of medicine, with doctors themselves serving as protectors of the standards. State governments responded by passing new laws requiring the licensing of all physicians. By 1900, medical education a few medical schools, notably Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, compared favorably with that in the leading institutions of Europe. The doctors such as William H. Welch at Hopkins revolutionized the teachings of medicine by moving students out of the classrooms and into laboratories and clinics. National Association of Manufacturers. There was a similar movement in other professions. By 1916, lawyers in all 48 states had established professional bar associations. The nation's law schools accordingly expanded greatly. Businessmen supported the creation of schools of business administration and created their own national organizations. The National Association of Manufacturers in 1895 and the United States Chamber of Commerce in 1912, even farmers, long the symbol of romantic spirit of individualism, responded to the new order by reforming through the National Farm Bureau Federation, a network of agricultural organizations designed to spread scientific farming methods. While removing the untrained and incompetent, the admission requirements also protected those already in professions from excessive competition and lent prestige and status to their trades. Some professionals used their entrance requirements to exclude African American women, immigrants, and other undesirables from their ranks. Others used to simply keep the numbers down to ensure demand would remain high. Women and the professions. Both by custom and by active barriers of law and prejudice, American women found themselves excluded from most of the emerging professions, but a substantial number of middle class women, particularly those emerging from the new women's colleges and coeducational state universities, entered professional careers nevertheless. Female dominated professions. A few women managed to establish themselves as physicians, lawyers, engineers, scientists, and corporate managers in the early 1900s. Several leading medical schools admitted women in 1900. About 5% of all American physicians were female, a proportion that remained unchanged until the 1960s. Most, however, turned by necessity to those helping professions that society considered vaguely domestic and thus suitable for women. Settlement houses, social work, and most important teaching. Indeed, in the late 19th century, more than two-thirds of all grammar school teachers were women, and perhaps 90% of all professional women were teachers. For educated black women in particular, the existence of segregated schools in the South created a substantial market for African American teachers. Women also dominated other professional activities. Nursing had become primarily a women's field during and after the Civil War. By the early 20th century, it was adopting professional standards, and many women entered academia after creating advanced degrees at such predominantly male institutions as the University of Chicago, MIT, or Columbia, and finding professional opportunities in the new expanding women's colleges. Okay, we can do this. We got this. Okay. Women in reform. The prominence of women in reform movements is one of the most striking features of progressivism. In most states during the early 20th century, women could not vote. No. They almost never held public office. They had footholds in only a few and usually primarily female-dominated professions and lived in a culture in which most people, male and female, believed that women were not suited for the public world. What then explains the prominent role so many women played in the reform activities of this time period? The new woman. Socioeconomic origins of the new woman. The phenomenon of the new woman, widely remarked upon at the time, was a product of social and economic changes that affected the private world as much as the public one. even if such changes affected mostly middle class people. By the end of the 19th century, almost all income producing activity had moved out of the home and into the factory or the office. At the same time, children were beginning school at earlier ages and spending more time there. For many wives and mothers who did not work for wages, the home was no longer an all consuming place. Technological innovations such as running water, electricity, and eventually household appliances made housework less onerous, and even if higher standards of cleanliness counterbalance many of these gains. Okay, so it was like it was kind of changing because since kids were going to school, the parents did not have to be the moms did not have to be like taking care of the children 24/7. Like the jobs of being in home, like being like like a wife or what they consider to be a woman at the time kind of changed into there's time and space to do other stuff. Declining family size also changed the lives of many women. Middle class white women in the late 19th century had fewer children than the mothers and grandmothers had born. They also lived longer. Many women thus now spent fewer years with young children in the home and lived more years after their children were grown. Boston marriages. Some educated women shunned marriage, believing that only by remaining single could they play the roles they envisioned in the public world. Single women were among the most prominent female reformers at the time. Jane Addams and Lillian Wall in the Settlement House movement, Frances Willard in the suffrage movement, Anna Howard Shaw in the suffrage movement, and many others. Some of these women lived alone, others lived with other women. Others, often in long term relationships, some of them quietly romantic, that were known at the time as Boston marriages. The divorce rate also rose rapidly in the late 19th century, from one divorce for every 21 marriages in 1880 to 1 in 9. By 1916, women initiated the majority of them, which is honestly that's kind of great. Not that is not great, but it's understandable because men are men. Okay, the club woman. Among the most visible signs of the increasing public roles of women in the late 19th century and the early 20th centuries were the women's clubs, which proliferated rapidly beginning in the 1880s and 1890s and became vanguard for many important reforms. The GFWC. The Women's Club began largely as a cultural organization to provide middle and upper class women with an outlet for their intellectual energies. In 1892, when women were formed the General Federation of Women's Clubs to coordinate the activities of local organizations, there was more than 100,000 members in nearly 500 clubs. By 1917, there was over 1 million. By the early 20th century, the club was becoming less concerned with cultural activities and more concerned with contributing to social betterment. Because many club members were um, Because many club members were from wealthy families, some organizations had substantial funds at their disposal to make their influence felt. And ironically, because women could not vote, the clubs had a nonpartisan image that made them difficult for politicians to dismiss. Black women occasionally joined clubs dominated by white women, but most such clubs excluded African Americans, and so black women formed clubs of their own. Some of them affiliated with the General Federation, but most became part of the Independent National Association of Colored Women. Some black clubs also took positions on issues of particular concern to African Americans, such as lynching and aspects of segregation. A public space for women. A women's club movement seldom raised over challenges to prevailing assumptions about the proper role of women in society. Few club women were willing to accept the arguments of such committed feminists as Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who in her 1898 book Women in Economics argued that the traditional definition of gender roles was exploitative and obsolete. Instead, the club movement allowed women to define a space for themselves in the public world without openly challenging the male dominated order. Much of what the clubs did was uncontroversial, planting trees, supporting schools, libraries, and settlement houses, building hospitals and parks. But club women were also an important force in winning passage of state and ultimately federal law that regulated the conditions of women and children labor. Established government inspection of workplaces, regulated the food and drug industries, reformed policies toward Native Americans, applied new standards to urban housing, and perhaps most notably outlawed the manufacture and sale of alcohol, the temperance movement. They were instrumental in pressuring state legislators in most states to provide mothers' pensions to widowed or abandoned mothers with small children, a system that ultimately became absorbed into the Social Security system. In 1912, they pressured Congress into establishing the Children's Bureau in the Labor Department, an agency directed to develop policies to protect children. Women's Trade Union League. In many of these efforts, the club wanted to form alliances with other women groups, such as the Women's Trade Union League, founded in 1903 by female union members and upper-class reformers. It was committed to persuading women to join unions, in addition to working on behalf of protective legislation for women. WTUL members held public meetings on behalf of female workers, raised money to support strikes, and marched on picket lines and bailed striking women out of jail. Perhaps the largest single reform of the Progressive era, and indeed one of the largest in American history, was the fight for women's suffrage. Radical challenge of women's suffrage. It's sometimes difficult for today's Americans to understand why the suffrage issue could have been the source of such enormous controversy. But at the time, suffrage seemed to many of its critics a very radical demand, in part because of the rationale some of its early supporters used to advance it. Throughout the late 19th century, many suffrage advocates presented their views in terms of natural rights, arguing that women deserve the same rights as men, including, first and foremost, the right to vote. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, for example, wrote in 1892 of women as the arbiter of their own destiny. If we are to consider her as a citizen, as a member of a great nation, she must have the same rights as all the other members. This was an argument that boldly challenged the views of many men and women who believed that society required a distinctive female sphere in which women would serve first and foremost as wives and mothers. And so, I'm gonna take a little break. Early attacks. Attacks? Oh, I already read this. Excuse me.